Hello. Hi, everyone. Hey, I know everyone had a late night last night, so we're here to make infrastructure sexy. We are starting off with 4 very sexy men to my left to heat up this place and talk nodes, staking, and other blockchain infrastructure. So before we kick it off, very quick intros, just everyone, who you are and what your company does, please.
Sure. Great intro, by the way. My name's Robert Ellison. I work at Allnodes. Allnodes is a staking infrastructure company. We run about 35,000 nodes at the moment on about 70 proof-of-stake networks. My background is in network engineering a long time ago, but now I do business development and marketing.
Hi everyone, my name is Burak Arikan. I'm an artist and technologist, founder of Graph Commons platform for mapping networks and analyzing data online. Also the founder of the Vaults.io project. It's basically, we just map you've probably seen in subnets and the validators across the multi-chain world, Avalanche and Cosmos. So yeah, I'm going to share some insights from that as well in this panel. Thank you.
Hey everybody, my name is Robbie Kruszynski. I'm the lead of developer relations at Blockdaemon, and Blockdaemon focuses on institutional and enterprise-grade staking solutions, setting up validators, offering a plethora of tooling for developers and those interested in setting up their validators, liquid staking. We offer a multitude of protocols, EVM and NOM. We're at 40 plus validators that we are always working on and supporting, and yeah.
Awesome, GM. My name's Danny. I'm with Nirvana Labs. We built a blockchain optimized cloud and essentially do everything on the infrastructure side for blockchain. So everything from RPC nodes, dedicated nodes, subnets, IPFS, and really anything that you could need with the infrastructure side.
So just for fun, there's basically 3 flavors. Oh, wait, I should introduce myself. Sorry, I'm Marc Blinder. I'm one of the founders and CEO of AIKON. We do cross-chain identity infrastructure. So we are not this same type of infrastructure, which is why I'm here to learn and listen to the experts to my left. And I want to start with having already learned from these guys that the basic 3 flavors of blockchain infrastructure are cloud hosting, bare metal hosting, and kind of indie home hosting. I'm going to just fabricate a little debate here and make Robert tell us why cloud hosting is the future of blockchain infrastructure.
I'm not going to agree with that, by the way.
No, but just for the sake of argument, so that people can learn, you just have to take that position. What's great about cloud hosting for blockchain?
I mean, it all comes down to risk, and it comes down to skill set too, and that sort of is implied risk. So my belief is that home staking is the bedrock, but it's not for everybody. And adoption is important across the infrastructure of blockchain. So opening up the doors to users who want to stake, for example, who want to be involved in DeFi, who might not be able to handle the technical acumen or hurdles of running their own hardware. So you need services like Allnodes, or you need cloud services to provide that security. And I think, in defense of cloud or specialized providers like Allnodes who just do blockchain and run their own hardware, is it's actually really hard to run blockchains.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, so and getting to that, so Robbie, again, for the sake of argument, you tell us why bare metal infrastructure is the only kind that really matters for the future.
Sure. I agree with Robert on a couple of points that he made. One being the difficulty when it comes to making sure everything is preserved, everything is up to date. Ultimately, when it comes to running validators, it comes with risk, right? And there's also technical debt that comes with this. Something that I think that Blockdaemon does quite well, and I'm quite proud to be part of, is because we focus on bare metal services. You have to consider, if you're running cloud, then you are obviously giving a tremendous amount of trust to those providers. And what you also have to start to think about is, how are those servers being loaded, right? What is that distribution going to be? So for us, when it comes to bare metal, it's number one going to be cheaper. And if you are going to trust, let's say, a cloud provider, why not trust a Web3 company that specifically focuses on infrastructure that is going to have full control over that bare metal to make sure that those servers are always going to be optimally running and you aren't going to run into any hiccups. And if you are going to run into hiccups, we have dedicated teams to make sure that those servers are always up to date, and if there are any issues, that those are resolved incredibly quickly.
Awesome. And then Danny, so can you stand up for the indie community? Tell us why the true spirit of blockchain is the individual node operators and stakers.
So,
again, I know I'm putting you on a side, but just for the sake of education here.
sake of education and everyone, it's the trustless aspect of it. So you don't have to rely on a large hyperscaler cloud or a third party. You're controlling the actual hardware yourself, and you're updating the hardware, making sure it's, all your nodes are synced, and theoretically, you don't have to trust anyone else to make sure that everything's running properly. It's all kind of on your own shoulders, and you don't run the risk of theoretically, say government says that AWS can't run nodes anymore. Now you lose all your nodes. You have all control over it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So now, Burak, you get to be the judge of this round one.
All right.
What do you think is the future of blockchain infrastructure?
Yeah, I think as you guys can guess, this is a balance, right? The problem of balance, like having individual hosting or nodes and cloud in between, right? So if you have just the cloud, it's a problem of provider centralization. As you know, the AWSs of the world, central exchanges of the world, the big existing Web2 incumbents of the world are getting into this game. Whereas we have amazing two cloud providers here, as far as I know, are doing their own work. But there's always a centralization problem in the world of cloud providing. It can happen, as you know. On the other side, individuals running their own nodes have this problem of uptime and reliability, as you know, or technical debt over time. You cannot catch up with the growing or the updates on the software and so on. So it's a balance. Like we have to have both.
Yeah.
We cannot have just either, and we need the balance of this, basically.
I think a good way to jump in there is there's a specific sort of, I guess, protocol which is called Rocket Pool that sort of solidifies what we're talking here. And one of the reasons it does, and of course it's on Ethereum, is that Rocket Pool community is very much about home stakers. That the majority of Rocket Pool users are home stakers. So it's a really interesting community because that's sort of the foundation. And so there's an idea that across the board, and even with Avalanche, is that the foundation of home stakers is very important, and you want to develop for those people. You don't want to make the blockchain so difficult that it only lands in the hands of like these large providers that have the capability. So you develop for the home stakers, but then the other side of that problem is, okay, that's only for a certain group of technophiles of it. And so what we see with Rocket Pool, because we're the only service provider that supports them on our own hardware outside of home staking, like you want that option, is people want to get involved. They want to do it themselves, but they don't know how. So they'll spin up a node on our services, learn the ropes easier, risk off, and then once they feel more comfortable, they might start running their own node.
So if we're talking about taking infrastructure to the people around the world, I'd be very interested to hear from some of the experts on the stage. Maybe we'll start with you, Robbie, on like where are the nodes that are running Avalanche today, geographically speaking?
Well, I think that depends, right? And I think that, like, maybe to pull back for a second, when it comes down to like infrastructure, you have to consider risks, right? And risks are going to be a big thing. So something that has to be considered, obviously, is going to be this conversation of decentralized versus centralized providers. And as you mentioned, Rocket Pool, right? We see a push for, let's say, like Lido and Rocket Pool that are working on more of a decentralized kind of aptitude, or rather their ethos. And then we look at something when it comes to RPC providers, being like Pocket, right? We look at storage, we look at IPFS, we look at storage with the J, right? All of them, I think, are really pushing toward that decentralized manner, and I think for the last 5 years, it's been primarily centralized. Oh, go for it.
And for those, in case anyone in the room or listening at home doesn't know, the RPC providers, right, that's the connections from servers to the blockchain, right? And then the storage and IPFS, those folks, they're storing data that can be accessed in a decentralized manner.
Right. So we have like that avenue, which is focusing more on like the decentralized or the decentralized lane, and then we start to see bigger players like Azure. We start to see Google. We start to see Amazon that really want to come into infrastructure itself.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's I think what it really does do is it pushes the needle forward, because now we have these powerhouses that are going to be offering services that are probably going to have a lot of ease of use, but we still have that decentralized manner. That is also going to be pushing as well. So ultimately, competition, I think, is healthy. But maybe to go back to your question, in terms of where the nodes are, I suppose that depends on the services. But specifically for us, and I think for a bunch of people, considering geolocations in terms of where everything is being set up is incredibly important. If we were to just for a moment speak about like Ethereum, only 15% of Ethereum is currently staked. Of that 15%, 60 of it is based in the United States. So this is something to keep in mind, right? And we can see other protocols that have higher amounts of percentages that have been staked, but in terms of their geolocation, it's still very centralized to the United States. So now how do we start to work with Central America, South America, Africa, et cetera, to make sure that that infrastructure is available so that we could start to diversify our geolocation?
Yeah, and Danny, so we're talking a little bit about the risks and this, geographic centralization and staking centralization. In your perspective, what's the best path forward for maintaining blockchains in a way that's really safe for the long run and minimizes these risks?
I think it depends what risks you're trying to mitigate, right? There's risks with whatever decision you make. Essentially, we're talking about like most of the nodes right now, even it doesn't matter if they're in America or in Europe, most of them are on AWS. Like that's just a fact. That's exactly why we built Nirvana Cloud, because it's another cloud. It's an option. So we run bare metal in 36 different locations around the world, right? Pretty much every continent besides Antarctica. And we want to try to decentralize, the locations, but also our data center providers, and build this cloud that's an alternative to an AWS, right? The whole tech stack is optimized for blockchain data, but it's another option where people could come in, use a Terraform provider, deploy their own nodes, right? It's the same thing of using AWS, but it's another option, that's not AWS or GCP or one of these other major clouds.
And that matters a lot, both for regulatory uncertainty, right? Because when you have these different jurisdictions, at least most of these jurisdictions are going to continue forward, even if one changes the laws, right? And then as well, you have just this sort of general sense that you don't want Amazon to own the whole world.
That's my feeling.
Yeah, no, totally. I get that. And Burak, when you're doing these maps of different chains, and I know you're doing the Avalanche subnets and stuff like that, do you do geolocation in the mapping you're doing?
Not necessarily, but we do a lot of the map of the overlapping between different subnets or chains. So a chain may have multiple. They have multiple nodes, and those nodes are also running in other chains. And those are sometimes, like in the world of Cosmos, they are entities. They are like it's a company that's running that, providing service. So node service, sorry. And then the same thing exists for Avalanche world as well. There are multiple, let's say, like validation services or companies. That's their business, and they are in multiple chains, right? And depending on where they run their validators, in Allnodes or other places, and they may be geographically distributed. But that the thing we don't look at it at the moment, but I think it's very critical, obviously. In terms of regulation too, like when we talk about geography, we talk about the regulatory, concerns right away. That's basically, that what matters, and having a robust network is really critical for that reason, yeah.
So we've heard, we got the competition is good, geographic diversity is good, different flavors of hosting is important for infrastructure, right? What else do you guys think is really going right in the industry these days, recently in blockchain infrastructure?
What's going right? I think if we zoom out really far, it's important to look at the user experience. We tend to sometimes be really in the weeds, and sometimes these concepts on layer 1s and layer 2s are quite nebulous, and in some senses you're looking at them and you're like, well, what problems are they solving for? And so I sort of take the stance of zooming out and be like, what is the user experience here? You know, what is actually happening on change? What are the risks we could solve for right now? And so one of the sort of really broad, interesting points to make there is that people are actually interested in infrastructure. And that's kind of new. Like, it's kind of like pre-crypto, who gives a shit about infrastructure, right? You're using Facebook or YouTube. All you care about is if it works. You know, unless you're part of, you know, unless you're a programmer or an engineer, you just care that it works, like the general public. So now you see that bubble of interest growing, and people, it's sort of like historically.
Yeah, sorry, we're being like attacked by flies up here,
sorry.
but
There's
we
like,
showered this morning. I swear, these guys smell good too. They don't just look good.
So one thing I'll bring up is like, it's sort of, we've come full circle, because if you look at the early, I mean, even the late 80s, early 90s of the internet, there was a real, people really cared about infrastructure. They cared about privacy. They're sort of the forefathers of crypto. And then that all got sideswiped when Web 2 came along, when the monetization came along, when browsers got introduced, and consumerism and passiveness. And so we've come a bit full circle back into those like forefather days of saying, okay, what are we actually doing here? Look at all this data. Do we have ownership? And do we actually care about the infrastructure? So I just see like that growing interest in infrastructure as being cool.
Well, yeah, that is an interesting question about this generation. So for the other folks on the panel, without giving too much information, like how much of your business is retail versus the kind of bigger institutional users?
Well, at least for, maybe prior to that, if I could just touch on Robert's point, which I thought was great. And I completely agree that we are starting to see this huge attraction for infrastructure. And obviously, as we start to see more and more protocols come up, the importance of infrastructure is going to be everything, right? And I think to the question you asked earlier, what's going right, I think as we start to see this importance and this care about infrastructure, we are starting to see a huge, push forward when it comes to security. And security is going to be everything, right? And it can be quite difficult. You want to make sure that everything's up to date. Obviously, each protocol is going to have their own roadmap. They're going to have their own cadence. They're going to have the own ideas that they want to promote. So now it's a forcing function for infrastructure providers to keep up to date with this. Pen testing, looking at tooling, making sure that there's audits, making sure the code is consistently up to date as there is updates to each of these individual networks. So I think that security right now is one of the things that's rapidly growing in terms of it. I mean, it always has been important, but now that we start to see eyes more on infrastructure, that's a forcing function for security. But to answer the question you asked,
About retail, yeah.
Primarily focus is on institution and enterprise.
Yeah. What about Danny at Nirvana?
Most of our customers are like blockchain companies. So like, whether it's a gaming company, a DeFi protocol, NFT marketplace, anyone who really needs that connectivity to the blockchain, it needs that very high reliability, very low latency to be able to transact and run their company on the blockchain.
Yep, makes sense. And Burak, with the sort of visualizations and data you're doing, is that mostly sort of institutional users, or is there some retail interest in that?
Well, definitely the mapping and visualization of data is for the general public, before everything, because we really wanted to have more people to get this vision of multi-chain, understand what it means, really, literally, through looking at the data in a visual way. That was really the point. And to get, everyone on the same page about this multi-chain vision was our real purpose there. And of course, that's a starting point for a project, but I can talk about the rest of the ideas later on. But yeah, that was the main point. Yeah.
And I know we're on the mainnet stage here, but let's talk a little bit about subnets. So do you guys think there's a risk of subnet centralization, right? So we've got this the big Avalanche mainnet, but do we need to be worried about the number of servers running the subnets?
Yeah, we do. Nets, I view them the same as the mainnet. So they off.
I think it's too early to worry about that right now. I think subnets are still more in the early stage, where like when you get the subnets up and running, when you actually be able to operate cross-chain on the subnets, have it be a very good user experience, right? And then we'll have more decentralization, once it's a proven product at this point. Like, the biggest risk is, just validators being run by, centralized parties. But I think that once we see more adoption of subnets, we see more subnets deployed, and there's more user activity in them, then we should see a little bit more decentralization. People are more interested. We have users that are individual users, not associated with companies, running validators on Nirvana infrastructure because they want to be able to validate individual subnets. So I think once we see more adoption of the technology, more people interested in running their own validators, then we'll see a little bit more decentralization there.
Yeah, and for the folks in the room, we talk a lot about the risks of centralization or the risks of incompetent infrastructure, if you will, but it sort of has this vague sense of doom to it. But can you guys talk a little bit about the real world outcomes when you have an overly centralized network, or the real world outcomes when you have malicious actors running nodes?
Not for nodes, but FTX. Yeah.
Oh, no, well, so that's like centralized businesses. No, we've all seen that, but like centralized infrastructure, can you give some real world examples on the blockchain space where poor infrastructure or poor network design has really led to disastrous outcomes?
I don't know if I could think of like a super disastrous outcome, but I do think that when it comes to the plethora of options that are available when it comes to infrastructure and also looking at clients someone would be using, I think it's really important that there is a diversity, because I think the further out you expand, if you're looking at Lighthouse or Prism or Besu or something like this,
And sorry, Lighthouse and Prism. For the folks listening.
So those are going to be like clients when you're trying to set up your own validator that you would be using with Geth potentially under the hood. But I think the fear is if everyone is, let's say, using AWS, as you had mentioned, and it is right now kind of the leading cloud provider when it comes to setting up validators, and if most people are using, let's say, one or two clients, I think that can be quite scary, because if something were to go awry, this becomes a huge issue. I don't think we've necessarily faced that yet, but it is something that I think everyone has to keep an eye on, and I think that as we start to continuously see people activating new technologies and new toolings to kind of deviate away from that, then it creates a safer atmosphere.
I can think of one example, actually. This happened, I think it was April last year, maybe it's 2 years ago, I forget, but Infura went down at one point. Because Infura runs MetaMask, just default to both consensus companies, most people didn't realize that their MetaMask ran off Infura. So there's about 2 or 3 hours where no one could do anything in crypto because Infura was down, so everyone's MetaMask wasn't working. So there's this whole blow up for
mass panic.
24, 48 hours, wait, we need to change this, type of essentially be able to copy, make a new, whether it's an Alchemy, QuickNode, Nirvana, any other company, make a RPC URL, plug it in your MetaMask, and then change the URL. I think that brought a lot of awareness because most people didn't realize how centralized everyone's MetaMask by default is, and that was a big blow up that happened a while back.
That's an interesting point because it ends up being a user problem. You just have to go into your MetaMask settings, change the RPC URL, and all of a sudden you're back in action. But by default, it was Infura, and a lot of users didn't know how to change that. So there's sort of an education that has to go on to teach people that the network's up just because the application's down, and so there is methods to get there.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I do think there's a big generational shift going on too. Teenagers these days know a lot more about technology than they did in my day as a teenager. And I think that's only going to get more extreme over time, so that stuff like thinking about how this application works and being able to think around that in a disaster, I think will be a lot more natural to the generations below us than it was to the generations above us.
There is another example we could use, which is more infrastructure focused, and it shows some resilience, which is what happened with Hetzner and Solana. I forget when that was, a year ago. So Hetzner, for those that didn't know, is a large infrastructure provider in Europe, and they basically shut down everyone working on Solana, which is obviously a pretty busy blockchain. And so it sent reels through the crypto universe because all of a sudden everyone had to scramble who was on that provider, and it was a lot of people. It didn't, it affected Solana negatively in the short term, but not really. So the network itself was resilient, but it took a lot. It was actually a learning lesson for everyone on Hetzner to be like, okay, that's a liability. Let's run our own hardware. Let's move off of these large cloud providers. So it was actually a good lesson.
Yeah, no, great thing in the long run.
Can I add something to this?
Yeah.
So I think in terms of infrastructure, like we're talking about here mostly like the node level, like the bare metal level infrastructure, but I think there are multiple layers to this, as you may all know, and the wallet is one of them. And wallet and between the wallet and the nodes, we have this API, obviously, and at the moment, it's highly centralized, like you mentioned, and including the Avalanche core wallet, we must have many options, right, for node for APIs. It doesn't exist today. It will hopefully come soon. And also, right now, like Avalanche core, as an example, is a wallet that focuses on subnet, seamless subnet usage, let's say, which is good. But at the same time, we need, I think, seamless API switching, for instance, something like that, on the wallet level. And obviously, we need more options of wallets. Like we don't want to have just one wallet. We need to have many diversity of wallets so that we have enough decentralization, on the wallet level as well, which is part of the infrastructure, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely love hearing that about the tools, right? It's not just the bottom layer, but that middle tier of infrastructure as well. So one thing we haven't mentioned yet, despite the fact that we got a panel full of infrastructure people up here, is latency. So as a naive listener, you might be thinking latency, whatever, the block times, maybe it's half a second on a fast network, maybe it's a minute or two on a slow network. Why would the number of milliseconds of latency matter that much in a slow blockchain world? I don't know, Danny, if you want to go first, but I know you tweet a lot about latency, so I wanted you to get the first bite of the apple.
Latency is, for most applications, pretty important, right? Because latency affects your user experience, which kind of what everything boils down to. So if you're going to a website, called Google, and you go to Google and it takes a minute to load, like you're going to be frustrated as a user. You're going to, you just want that instant connection. So the same thing with blockchain, right? So the settlement layer for each blockchain is different, right? Ethereum will be slower than Solana, which is a high TPS chain, which will be, depending on the subnet. Some subnets can be super high TPS, some can be super low, but the actual latency of when the transaction occurs and how fast the application is processing, that is a matter of their latency, right? That's why Nirvana Cloud, what we did was focus very much on latency and reliability, because we want to be able to offer games and all these user-centric applications the fastest latency possible, because we believe that will affect the user experience.
Sure.
I could jump in with something a little more technical, because it's sort of a problem that's occurring right now with regards to latency, not so much with Avalanche, but with Ethereum, which is what's referred to as MEV. And so when we look at blockchains, of course, it's you're incentivized for good behavior, you're penalized for bad behavior. It's a founding principle of every blockchain. But what you're seeing on Ethereum with the mempool is you could act as a bad actor and get away with it. So if you're using a DeFi application, you are doing a transaction, there's routers in the middle there's bundlers, and what they're doing is basically front-running and skimming. You're using MEV bots. And so it's a negative user experience, because you're trying to transact and your transaction is being manipulated. And that war, if you look behind the scenes and peel back the curtains on how that actually acts, is very much a latency war. It's who gets there first, and it's a bot war to a certain extent. And so right now on Ethereum, it's a complex issue that's trying to be solved for, because that's a bad user experience.
Oh, totally.
I totally agree, because it comes down to making sure that the MEV relays are going to obviously have their speed and a redundancy and latency, but also you want to make sure that those transactions that are being posted are also just as fast, because to your point, you can have bad actors pending on that latency, which can completely obliterate.
There's no penalization for the bad actors, which is sort of counter to the blockchain, right?
Yeah, no, it's kind of heartbreaking when you think about this big vision of the blockchain as a place where there's equal access, and we wouldn't have these Wall Street high-frequency traders front-running everyone's trades, and now they're finding a way in, at least on some chains. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to be done there. Well, and while we're kind of thinking about the future here, what and I think each of you can take a crack at this in your own time. What would you most like to see in the future of the blockchain? Not 10 years from now, but in the next 2 years, like what's a change you are hoping for on Avalanche or some other chain?
That's a big question. I think what excites me in terms of Avalanche is subnets. So I think, getting subnets off the ground, making it easy to use subnets, it's a challenge. Whether that's infrastructure-wise, whether that's integration-wise, is very exciting. I think if we peel back, though, what's in crypto, what's really sort of the tone is changing to what's called user abstraction. So if we really want the general public, if we really want finance involved, blockchain right now is just too complicated. So as the abstraction occurs and users are able, like companies are basically able to use the blockchain as the foundation, but that complication is abstracted from the user, I think that's going to bring a lot of people into the space.
Love that. User experience, near and dear to my heart. All right, Burak, you're next.
So I think, like you said, subnets are critical for the scaling of the blockchains to reach billions of users, per day, hopefully. But and that to reach that, subnets are critical. But at the same time, running a subnet or having these multiple nodes or a single node running multiple subnets, these kind of concepts are quite new, kind of. It existed in the merged mining years ago, but now it's more practical, let's say. But this brings a lot of challenges. For instance, like the node operators, like they have to have, if they are running multiple chains, if they have to have, specialized hardware maybe, or certificates and licenses, or maybe some data flows, or bandwidth requirements and so on, which is again a thing for the node providers in general. But at the same time, we are entering an era of, decentralized, like programmable networks, kind of. It's different than just like programmable contracts or machines. We have now this new era of like networks interacting with each other all the time, and they're overlapping sometimes. And there's always this like, kind of unknown situations about the state of the network, and you have to have a way to deal with those kind of issues.
Cool. All right, anyway, thanks. Yeah, the ever-expanding fractal of useful blockchains. Great idea for the future.
I guess for me, like number one, like education, I think is incredibly important. And just as we spoke about, like how easy it would be to like just turn that RPC on MetaMask, and a lot of people perhaps didn't know you could do this. That's incredibly important. So we have to consider education. User experience is also going to be everything. But what I think when it comes to interoperability, thinking about L1s and L2s and how L2s are really starting to push forward. Coinbase, for example, launching their own L2. We're going to probably start to see a number of companies do this. And so from an infrastructure standpoint, always being at the ready to make sure that there's adoption and support for this, and relying on the security of L1s, but that whole L1 fattiness that's existed for so long, I think will start to be abstracted away as we start to see L2s and then inevitably L3s.
Awesome. All right, so more education and really good L2s for the future. All right, Danny.
Yeah, I totally agree with what everyone said. Like, I'm a big multi-chain guy. Like, I love Avalanche, but like, I really believe the future's multi-chain. I believe that boils down to the user experience, right? You're just gonna go to like, a game and like not know what blockchain it's built on, or if it's on a subnet, you're just gonna play the game because it's a good game and you enjoy it. And then second, I'm really excited for like traditional like Web 2 brands and institutions to start using blockchain technology to improve their businesses, to make things more transparent. You think of two like Nike.swoosh and like the Starbucks Odyssey. Those are two early on case studies, but like those are two massive companies using the technology, not to try and like extract value from the users, but to provide a better user experience to their customers and hopefully retain loyalty, other stuff. But I'm really excited to see more and more brands and Web 2 companies get into the space and start using the technology.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much. You heard it here first, folks. That is, user experience is the future of blockchain. Multi-chain is the future of blockchain. L2s that actually work is the future of blockchain, and more education so the public can actually understand what we're doing and why it helps traditional businesses, not just Web3 businesses. That's what's coming for all of us next year, the year after that, and the year after that. Thank you all so much for listening to our panel. And thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
See you, everyone.